Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Doug McKelway, and for Brett Baer. Donald Trump says he has agreements to fill major spots in his upcoming administration. But the steady stream of traffic into and out of Trump's headquarters in New York continues unabated. Many are names you'd recognize. Let's get the latest now on the comings and goings tonight. Correspondent Peter Doocy is outside Trump Tower. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, Doug. Today, nearly a dozen Republicans and one Democrat took elevator rides up to see the president-elect for a chance to work down in D.C. with him in a month and a half. 9 prominent political figures visited the 26th floor of Trump Tower today, many to interview for posts in a Trump administration, and some shared their pitch to the president-elect with the press, like former Senator Scott Brown, who wants to run the VA.
Hey, listen, I'm not competing with anybody. You know, I think I'm the best person.
Some others came to Manhattan just to hear the president-elect out, like Oklahoma's Governor Mary Fallin, who Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway says the team likes for Interior Secretary.
No, I was not offered a position. It was just an initial meeting to discuss a wide range of topics.
Texas Governor Rick Perry, under consideration for jobs in the defense or energy departments, was here too. And so was Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, a veteran and a Democrat who endorsed Bernie Sanders in the primaries and who has been critical of both President Obama and Secretary Clinton for refusing to address certain enemies abroad as radical Islamic terrorists. But Gabbard said in a statement, quote, "While the rules of political expediency would say I should have refused to meet with President-elect Trump, I never have and never will play politics with American and Syrian lives." There were more sit-downs at a Trump property in Bedminster, New Jersey this weekend. Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach brought his plan to reform the Homeland Security Department. Retired General James Mattis met about the Defense Secretary job, which Senator John McCain endorsed him for today. And even Mitt Romney, who spent months imploring Republican voters to pick anyone but Trump, got an invite to talk about perhaps the crown jewel of cabinet jobs.
Governor Mitt Romney came in. They had a good meeting. It was a warm and a substantive exchange, and I know he's under active consideration to be the Secretary of State of the United States, along with some other very distinguished Americans.
As for the president-elect's own transition from business to politics, advisors are deflecting concerns tonight that a recent meeting with Indian businessmen here in Manhattan represents an issue separating his own interests from national interests.
I'm very confident he's not breaking any laws. He has many lawyers, accountants, and advisors who tell him what he must do and what he can't do. And he's a businessman. He is also working a transition. He's the president-elect. And, you know, we're in unprecedented times.
Trump wasn't just working on plans to shape the government today. He was also sitting down with executives in charge of how his first term will be covered, meeting with the bosses from 5 big news networks, including Fox News Channel. Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway says it was a reset meeting, and she thinks it went well. Doug?
Peter Doocy outside Trump Tower. Thank you, Peter. Let's take a closer look now at one of the contenders for defense secretary. Trump calls James Mad Dog Mattis a general's general. But is he the right fit for Pentagon chief? National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin has that story tonight.
Hello, General James Mattis was known by his Marines as Mad Dog when he oversaw the 1st Marine Division during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He then led them into Fallujah. He served in the First Gulf War and led Task Force 58 into Afghanistan after 9/11. His nickname stemmed from what his troops saw as the effect he had on the enemy. His radio call sign was Chaos. As a lieutenant general, he was known for his blunt talk.
You go into Afghanistan, you got guys who slapped women around for 5 years because they didn't wear a veil. You know, guys like that ain't got no manhood left anyway, so it's a hell of a lot of fun to shoot them. You know, I mean, it's a good fight.
General Mattis is on the short list to be named Defense Secretary.
General's just leaving, fantastic. General Mattis, fantastic.
After the meeting, Mr. Trump tweeted, "Mattis is a general's general." His quotables are reminiscent of George S. Patton, quote, "Be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everybody you meet. I don't lose any sleep at night over the potential for failure. I cannot even spell the word." And perhaps most relevant today, no war is over until the enemy says it's over. We may think it over, we may declare it over, but in fact, the enemy gets a vote.
When you've gone through the horrors of war, like most senior military people have, normally we want our policymakers to exhaust all the options short of war. war before the decision's made to go to war. And that is where Jim Mattis is coming from.
Mattis would be the first general to be Secretary of Defense since President Harry Truman nominated five-star General George C. Marshall at the start of the Korean War. The tradition of civilian control of the military dates back to George Washington and the 1947 National Security Act, which instituted a 7-year cooling-off period for generals. Before retiring in 2013, Mattis served as the head of U.S. Central Command for 3 years. His opposition to the Iran nuclear deal raised eyebrows in the West Wing.
It's an arms control agreement that fell short of a lot of hopes.
Mattis never made any secret about who from the Middle East he believed posed the greatest risk to the U.S.
Iran presents the most significant regional threat to stability and security.
General Mattis was unceremoniously told to retire 3 months early from CENTCOM. He was never given the courtesy of a phone call from President Obama or the defense secretary. He was handed a note by an aide informing him of the commander-in-chief's decision, Doug.
And Jennifer, what role would President Obama play, if any, in whether or not Mattis gets the SecDef job?
Well, remember, General Mattis would need a law passed by Congress to make an exception to the 7-year cooling-off period that bars military officers from serving in civilian roles at the Pentagon. The law could originate in the Senate Armed Services Committee, where Senator John McCain, as chairman, has already expressed support publicly for General Mattis. The law must be passed before the nomination can be sent to Congress and would be subject to a veto from President Obama if Congress decides to act before January 20th. In other words, President Obama essentially fired General Mattis from his position at CENTCOM because he was seen as too hawkish on Iran, and now he again holds General Mattis's fate in his hands, Doug.
Jennifer Griffin, good to have you back in Washington.
Thank you.
NSA Director Mike Rogers finds himself in a precarious position tonight. His current boss may be trying to get rid of him, but he's already interviewed with the man who could be his next boss. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge tells us what's going on.
NSA Director Admiral Mike Rogers took the helm of the secretive surveillance agency and U.S. Cyber Command in April 2014. Not to be confused with former Congressman Republican Mike Rogers, who recently left Trump's transition team, the NSA Director avoided reporters Thursday at Trump Tower, where he met with the president-elect to reportedly discuss leading the 16 intelligence agencies. Less than 48 hours later, anonymous sources told the Washington Post that Rogers' boss, the current Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, and Defense Secretary Ash Carter had told the White House they wanted Rogers out. Carter reportedly had concerns about Rogers' NSA performance. Clapper supported a new structure that would divide the NSA and U.S. Cyber Command, with Rogers no longer in charge. National security experts said the public airing of these disagreements is highly unusual.
The timing's odd because obviously he visited with President-elect Trump, who has every right to interview anyone he wants for any senior position. So I think it's unprecedented, and it's really unfortunate.
Republican Senator John McCain, who leads the Armed Services Committee, said, quote, "Any suggestion that Admiral Rogers should be fired is certainly unwarranted. He has my full confidence, and I hope he will have further opportunities to serve our country." The Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Devin Nunes, went further, sending a letter to Clapper and Carter demanding their immediate testimony to answer questions about the timing of the Post story. Nunes spoke to Fox by phone.
There are people with vested interests who are trying to kill Admiral Rogers' chances. It's quite clear to me that's the case, but it's really petty and really sad that they'd stoop to this level to attack a military officer.
At a security conference in Canada, Rogers responded.
I am just not going to go down this road. I'm not going to comment on anything that's in the media. I'm accountable for my actions. I certainly understand that.
In October, NSA contractor Harold Martin III was charged with stealing government secrets. Rogers is credited with helping uncover that compromise, the second major breach of classified information on his watch. By contrast, when Edward Snowden leaked thousands of documents in 2013, Rogers' predecessor, General Keith Alexander, kept his job, Doug.
Thank you, Catherine Herridge. Executives from the maker of the anti-allergy medication EpiPen are refusing to testify before a Senate committee next week. Lawyers for the Mylan say that's because their $465 million settlement over allegations that it overcharged for the drug is still pending. Prices for EpiPen have increased by more than 500% since the year 2007. All three major indexes closed at record highs today. The Dow gained 89, the S&P 500 finished ahead 16, and NASDAQ surged 47. Coming up next, President Obama meets one final time with the thorn in his side. But first, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 46 in Charlotte, as wildfires are still causing problems in western North Carolina, and weather forecasters are not offering much hope for help. Dry conditions are continuing, and no rain is forecast in that area. Smoke is causing air quality issues in many counties. Fox 32 in Chicago, as about 500 workers at O'Hare Airport say they will go on strike after the holiday weekend. The group of baggage handlers, janitors, and wheelchair attendants is seeking union representation, but they say they'll wait until a week from tomorrow to walk off the job. Tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. This is a Fox News Alert. A tragedy tonight in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Fox 17 in Nashville is reporting multiple fatalities in a horrible school bus accident. Chattanooga Police Chief Fred Fletcher says that 35 students were on the bus from Woodmore Elementary when it crashed. He said that 23 have been transported and rescue efforts are ongoing. Counselors are coming in from across the state. Police say the bus driver is cooperating in the investigation. And a second Fox News Alert. President-elect Donald Trump says that he will issue an executive action on his first day in office, withdrawing the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. The statement comes just hours after Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said that the TPP would be meaningless without U.S. participation. Rejecting the TPP was one of Trump's signature campaign promises. And another alert, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake rocked Japan about 2 hours ago. A tsunami warning for waves of up to 10 feet has been issued. It could affect the same area north of Tokyo, where a nuclear power plant was destroyed by a huge tsunami following an offshore quake in the year 2011. The French Interior Minister says that anti-terrorism police have foiled a terror plot that has been in the works for several months. 7 people were arrested in Strasbourg and Marseille. The suspects are believed to have originally targeted the Euro 2016 soccer tournament, but changed their plans. And authorities in New York are charging a U.S. resident from Yemen with plotting a terror attack similar to the one in Nice, France, last summer. In that incident, a terrorist driving a large truck drove through a Bastille Day crowd. Authorities say Mohammed Naji wanted to use a large garbage truck to attack pedestrians in Times Square. He was arrested just this morning in New York. Turkey wants the U.S. to reconsider a proposal for a no-fly zone in northern Syria. Government forces pounded besieged rebel-held neighborhoods of Aleppo for a 7th day. Airstrikes hit most of the hospitals in the area over the weekend. The UN's humanitarian chief says conditions have, quote, gone from terrible to terrifying and now barely survivable. One thing that President Obama likely will not miss after he leaves office is the thorn in his side known as Vladimir Putin. Many Obama critics say the Russian president has consistently outmaneuvered and outsmarted his American counterpart. The two men met one last time over the weekend. Senior political correspondent Mike Emanuel has details from the White House tonight.
It was a candid and courteous meeting, but very clear about the strong differences that we have on policy.
On his likely final foreign trip in office, President Obama spoke briefly with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And while Putin said he thanked Mr. Obama, it was clear their relationship wasn't easy.
The dialogue between us was not simple. It was complicated, you can even say, to work with each other.
Mr. Obama said among the most difficult issues with Moscow is Syria.
We are still deeply concerned about the bloodshed and chaos that's being sown by constant bombing attacks by Assad, the Russian military, against populations in Aleppo.
Today, the Russians announced plans to deploy state-of-the-art missiles into Russia's westernmost Baltic region in response to U.S. missile defense plans, a move the State Department calls destabilizing, with Moscow's aggression in Ukraine another serious concern. The Baltics remain a troubling issue.
I urged him to instruct his negotiators to work with ourselves, with France, Germany, with Ukraine, to see if we can get that done before my term is up.
President-elect Trump spoke with Putin by phone a week ago when aides say Mr. Trump said he's looking forward to a strong and enduring relationship with Russia.
The newly elected president of the United States reaffirmed his intent to normalize United States-Russia relations.
Senate Armed Services Chair John McCain sounds alarmed about a potential thaw with Moscow, saying last week, quote, "At the very least, the price of another reset would be complicity in Putin and Assad's butchery of the Syrian people. That is an unacceptable price for a great nation." And South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham warned on Russia he intends to be, quote, "a bit of a hard ass." Yet at the State Department today, spokesman John Kirby didn't want to preach to the Trump team.
The degree to which or how the incoming administration will look at that is, again, up to them to decide. But relations with Russia remain critical.
The president suggested that people should take a wait-and-see approach to learn how Mr. Trump will handle some of these difficult issues. But he said the reality of world events will likely force the president-elect to adjust some of his thinking. Doug?
Mike Emanuel at the White House tonight. Thank you, Mike. The U.S. Navy has come to the rescue of some Iranian fishermen. Pentagon producer Lucas Tomlinson tells us what happened when an American military helicopter came upon some folks from a not-too-friendly country in need of assistance.
A U.S. Navy MH-60 Seahawk helicopter flying off USS Eisenhower in the middle of the Persian Gulf spotted a small Iranian vessel dead in the water Friday. The Iranian mariners waved a light to get the aircrew's attention, signaling they were in distress. The aircraft carrier directed a nearby destroyer, USS Nitsa, to render assistance. A month ago, Nitsa fired Tomahawk cruise missiles into Yemen, destroying 3 Iranian-backed Houthi radar installations believed responsible for firing missiles at U.S. Navy warships in the Red Sea. U.S. Navy sailors offered the 3 stranded Iranians a new battery and a case of water. U.S. Navy ships, like all vessels at sea, are required to monitor maritime radios and respond to distress calls.
It's not a foreign policy requirement. It is, however, a common practice of all seagoing nations that you help mariners in distress.
It was not the first time the U.S. Navy helped mariners on the high seas. In a statement, it said, quote, "Ships deployed to U.S. Naval Forces Central Command assisted mariners on more than 30 occasions since 2012. 12 of which involved Iranian mariners. Less than a year ago, Iran was not as generous, capturing 10 American sailors at gunpoint and holding them for 15 hours after one of their vessels became disabled. Over the summer, Fox News traveled to the Strait of Hormuz off the coast of Iran with the head of U.S. Central Command responsible for American forces in the Middle East. Do these Iranians need to be held accountable for capturing your sailors and holding them at gunpoint?
I think they should be held accountable for that, and I think it's a contravention of kind of accepted maritime professionalism, and so I think they should be held accountable for that.
Last week on Capitol Hill, the director of national intelligence said Iran's behavior has not gotten better since the nuclear agreement. The U.S. Navy says in the first half of 2016, Iranian harassment of its warships in the Persian Gulf doubled when compared to the same time in 2015. And Iranian-backed forces are helping surround Syria's Aleppo, where hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians remain trapped. Doug?
Lucas Tomlinson at the Pentagon tonight. Thank you, Lucas. Iraqi forces are going house to house now in the outskirts of Mosul. Their advance on the city is being complicated, though, by suicide car bombings and the use of human shields. Correspondent Benjamin Hall has our update tonight.
Progress to retake Mosul has slowed to almost a crawl, despite 6 weeks of fierce fighting. Today, Iraqi troops paused and regrouped, but are still 6 miles from the city centre. ISIS has also released footage showing its fighters engaging Iraqi troops. It's a look at the battle through the terror group's eyes. Small bands of fighters and snipers holed up in houses, holding back whole armies. That's in part because of a reluctance by the US and its allies to use overwhelming firepower as they seek to avoid civilian casualties. In the eastern district of Ulma, families are fleeing from the battle. These people were lucky, but observers say there are over 1 million others in the city ahead. The Iraqi government has now sent half a dozen truckloads of food into liberated areas, but most still worry about a looming humanitarian disaster. Today, Iraq's foreign minister talked about Donald Trump's election and its effect on the fight, but said he expected no change in US policy. Progress slows in Mosul. To the west, there have been successes by Iranian-backed Shia militias who recently captured the Tal Afar airbase. These paramilitary groups have continued their move to cut off the supply route between Mosul and Syria, raising concerns about future sectarianism. One of those Shia militia is called Kataib Hezbollah. They're designated a terror group by the US, meaning that as US-backed forces move in the east of Mosul, Iranian-backed militia, including this terror group, move in the west. It's a constant reminder of how complex this battle really is. Doug?
Benjamin Hall in London tonight. Thank you, Benjamin. Israel's prime minister is in a very tough spot tonight. It involves land upon which some of his people have built their homes, but the land might actually belong to the Palestinians. Correspondent Connor Powell explains from Jerusalem.
In the same week that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu celebrated becoming Israel's longest-serving leader, the longtime American ally is also facing one of his most serious political crises. Netanyahu is battling his own political supporters in parliament over Israel's controversial settlement policy in the West Bank. After years of legal wrangling, Israel's Supreme Court ruled the Amona settlement must be dismantled by December 25th. The community of 40 families was built on privately owned Palestinian land, according to the findings of the Israeli Supreme Court. Jewish settlers, however, have called on Netanyahu to stop the destruction, insisting this small outpost is legally theirs.
We are the sons of Israel. We came back to our birthrights, to our homeland.
In an effort to save Amona, Israel's conservative coalition passed legislation that retroactively legalized it and thousands of other homes built on private Palestinian land. Critics called the move legalized theft, while Israel's attorney general said the bill was contrary to Israeli and international law. Netanyahu, who has long championed Israel's settlements, warned, however, leaving Amona in place would draw international scrutiny that could threaten all Israeli settlements. Netanyahu ultimately voted in favor of the bill, fearing a backlash from his conservative political rivals. In 2006, similar efforts to dismantle Israeli settlements led to violent clashes. The sight of Jewish soldiers fighting with Jewish citizens sent shockwaves through Israel. Palestinian officials and the international community have long criticized Israeli settlements, arguing many are built on stolen Palestinian property and that settlements undermine an independent Palestinian state.
There is no such a thing as legal or illegal settlements. All Israeli settlement activities in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are illegal.
Israeli settlers have vowed to resist the forceful dismantling of the Amona settlement, raising the possibility that once again violent clashes could break out between Israeli citizens and the Israeli security forces. Doug?
Connor Powell tonight. Thank you very much for that. The transition process continues, and we are waiting for some of the glamour positions to be filled. We'll talk about it with the panel when we come back. Comment from Vice President-elect Mike Pence coming in the aftermath of a report in the Argentinian newspaper La Nación, among many other sources, that said that during a congratulatory phone call with the president of Argentina, Trump apparently brought up this issue of a high-rise that he's building there, asking the president to expedite some of the process of bringing that construction to a finish. Now, after that report, apparently the newspaper, as well as the president of Argentina and the Trump transition team, denied that the conversation ever took place. But it produced a heated exchange between a New York Times reporter and Kellyanne Conway today at Trump Tower. Let's listen into that.
There's some reports that Mr. Trump continues to transact business while he conducts the transition. Is that appropriate? And is that an appropriate use of his time? And are you confident that he is not breaking any laws?
Very confident he's not breaking any laws. He has many lawyers, accountants, and advisors who tell him what he must do and what he can't do. And he's a businessman. He is also working a transition. He's the president-elect. You know, we're in unprecedented times. We have someone who is very successful.
Well, let's bring in our panel now. Daniel Halper of the New York Post. Also, Susan Page, Washington bureau chief at USA Today, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Dan, let's start with you. When does he cease becoming a businessman, if he still is, and becoming a president?
Well, it probably should have happened about yesterday, or when he got elected. Look, what was the knock against Hillary Clinton is that she was crooked, that she benefited off of the state, off of her service in government and her family. And that was Crooked Hillary, right? That's what Donald Trump called her throughout the campaign, and he obviously was very successful in doing so. He needs to be careful now going forward that any appearance of conflict of interest will be held against him, will be questioned, and reporters will ask what is going on if this is not dealt with properly in the next, during the transition period. This is a very pivotal time for him and his business, because it will really shape, there's just a few blocks from here and from the White House, there's a Trump hotel. There was a report over the weekend that diplomats are staying or have been feel pressured to stay at that hotel. Those sorts of things could dog him throughout his presidency if he's not able to deal with it at this moment.
And Susan, this is all complicated by the fact that his children are the Trump business partners as well. So it's virtually impossible for them to not know who he's negotiating with as president. How does he extricate himself from this relationship?
I think it's so complicated. It's so unprecedented. We've never had a president this wealthy or one with this kind of empire, an empire that bears his name, and his children are going to run it. So the possibility of the kind of blind trust that past presidents have done is simply not an option here. I think it's going to be a continuing issue that he'll need to address day by day, week by week. It's not as though he's going to stop being Trump. And the Trump industry, the Trump network, the Trump empire is not going to go away. They're going to have to figure out ways to proceed with the family business that his kids are going to run in a way that reassures Americans that he's not mixing that with the public's business.
Charles?
I don't think it can be done. I don't think this is a complicated problem. I think this is an insoluble problem. First of all, we've never had a president with holdings so widespread around the world. Second, as he himself has said in many of the depositions he's done over the years, the value of his company fluctuates according to perception. And the main element of the values of a lot of his properties has to do with his name. Many of them are not his, they slap his name on and the value increases and he gets a payment. So the idea, what you would normally do is you sell everything, because you can't have a blind trust for a business that's so visible. You have to sell everything. But that, of course, would impact the value. It would be a fire sale. He would never do that. He spent his entire life constructing this extremely closely held empire that all revolves around him and reflects him. It would require him to basically look back on the 30 years of his life he built this and to say, that's over forever. I'm now going to liquidate my holdings, and from now on I'm president and president only. Unless he does that, there is no answer to this, and every time he makes a phone call to a head of state where he has a business interest, there will be questions.
And the chances of that actually happening?
Close to zero. But then again, I said that about his chances of winning the presidency.
Right.
So take that with a grain of salt.
Okay. Another development just within the half hour or so, Donald Trump released his executive action plan for day one. Let's take a look at some of the bullet points here. On the issue of trade, he plans to issue a notification of intent to withdraw from the TPP and instead negotiate fair bilateral trade deals. On the subject of energy, cancel job-killing restrictions on the production of American energy, including Shell Energy. On the subject of regulation, for every one new regulation, 2 old regulations must be eliminated. National security. Asked the Department of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to develop a comprehensive plan to protect America's vital infrastructure from cyber attacks. On immigration, direct the Department of Labor to investigate all abuses of visa programs that undercut the American worker. And lastly, on ethics reform, impose, and this gets to our first discussion of the day, impose a 5-year ban on executive officials becoming lobbyists after they leave the administration, and a lifetime ban on executive officials lobbying on behalf of a foreign government. Reaction, Daniel, we'll start with you.
Well, I think it must be a heartening sign if you're a Trump supporter, because it shows that he's organized, that he has thought about his administration at this point, and he's looking, we see this very public process of him bringing people up to Trump Tower. He's interviewing people for cabinet positions. Donald Trump, as Dan Quayle said on Sunday Futures with Maria Bartiromo over the weekend, Dan Quayle said something to the effect that he has basically 100 or 200 days, basically until about July, in order to enact what he wants to get done. And if he comes in organized and he doesn't fight and he doesn't lead unnecessary fights over his cabinet, then he'll be able to get a lot of things done that he promised on immigration, on TPP, on trade, on all these things. And if he comes disorganized, and if he fights unnecessarily so over various appointments or people he might name, then he won't be able to get those things done. So it's got to be a heartening sign if you're a Trump fan.
Susan?
Well, not really a surprise, these proposals, mostly things he enumerated in that speech he gave at Gettysburg before the election. The idea that he's backing out of TPP on day one, that's new, and there's some supporters of the trade deal that had held out hopes that maybe they could convince him it was a good idea. That clearly is not going to happen. I think also the lobbying ban is an interesting thing, because one of the most powerful things for President Obama when he came in was to try to address some of this culture of Washington stuff that alarms a lot of voters. And it's interesting if Trump really tackles that in a serious way, not letting people who serve in his administration ever lobby for a foreign government and banning them from lobbying for 5 years after they leave government employment. That is a serious restriction.
Charles?
I think it's a good list. It shows, I agree, how serious he is about some of the things he campaigned on. I think the TPP is a little bit regrettable. It's sort of like Obama's Guantanamo. It's a fixed idea. It's not going to change. There's no way he would be in favor of the TPP, but I think we're going to see the cost of that rise as those Pacific allies of ours, including even Australia, are now going to seek their own deals with China as a result. We may live to regret that.
So it empowers China.
Absolutely. The Chinese are the ones who are the biggest beneficiaries of the death of a TPP. But lastly, what's not on the list? What's interesting is I would have expected the executive order Obama had signed to legalize the 5 million illegal aliens that are being held up in the court, so there's no real urgency. But if you wanted to show decisiveness, you would cancel that on day one. I think he will eventually, but I'm just surprised it wasn't on the list. It would send a real statement had he did it, were he to do it in the very first hour.
Next up, the Pope makes a big change to church doctrine on abortion.
I thought about the habit of getting rid of babies before they are born, this horrendous crime. They get rid of them because it is better like that, because it is convenient. It is a huge responsibility. That is a grave sin, no? A huge responsibility.
And in a letter, just following up on what you heard the Pope say right there, he wrote, "In the same way, however, I can and must state that there is no sin that God's mercy cannot reach and wipe away when it finds a repentant heart seeking to be reconciled with the Father." The Pope extending indefinitely the power of Catholic priests to forgive women who have had abortion, the announcement made in an apostolic letter released Monday. Back with the panel now. Daniel?
Well, who am I to question the Pope, obviously? But look, he's made it very clear that the Catholic Church doesn't view abortion in any way different. It's not such a departure, I think, from Catholic tradition and Catholic ethics as some are making this out to believe in the mainstream media. But it does show, I think, look, we're at a time, obviously, when there's right-wing populism really sweeping across Europe, obviously here in America with Donald Trump. But here he is, this perceived liberal Pope who's really able to reach out, I think, to new people and to really not transform his religion, but transform the way his religion is sometimes perceived. I think it shows, it's an odd paradox, right, where you have this nationalism that's not religious contrasted with this Catholicism, which is very liberal. And I think he is, in a way, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but in a way, I think he's able to reach more people by sort of shifting the tone and by allowing forgiveness where some ideologies are not.
Susan, we've seen this schism growing in the Catholic Church in this country, at least. Senator Tim Kaine, a perfect example of this, that he's deeply opposed to abortion himself, but thinks that Roe v. Wade ought to stand.
That's right, and we're about to get to a point, I think politically, a real pivot point when it comes to abortion with the inauguration of Donald Trump, who will make immediately one nomination for the Supreme Court. If he gets a second nomination to the Supreme Court to replace one of the 5 justices who have supported abortion rights, then we might very well see an overturning of the Roe versus Wade decision. And in any case, you know, Congress already voted to ban all funding for Planned Parenthood. That was prevented only by a veto by President Obama. Well, that hurdle is about to expire. So I think we're going to see, even while the Pope is, I think, trying to act in a merciful way on the issue of abortion, we're going to see, I think, this issue get joined with a new seriousness in the United States.
Charles?
I think the church is doing this sort of outside the context of American politics. The church is a slightly more venerable institution than even the United States. I think he's done something wonderful. And it's not a radical step. We've already had a year, the year of mercy, in which the Pope allowed this to happen, meaning allowed this to be done by priests. Before that, it could only have been done by bishops, cardinals, and the Pope himself to grant forgiveness. But all that the Pope is doing is extending that delegation of power a little bit lower down as a way to make it easier. I think it really is an act of mercy. And it showed sort of a lack of vindictiveness of the church imposing its will. But nonetheless, the will remains unchanged. They're absolutely rock-rib committed to the idea that this is a terrible thing to do and it should not be done. And I think, you know, years from now, in decades, people are going to look back on the issue and commend the Catholic Church for having held its own very unpopularly when there was this sweep and wave of legalizing abortion and to make it like an appendectomy, where the church was the one institution that would not waver despite the ridicule and the mockery and the attacks it suffered. I think our country is going to come to some accommodation ultimately, and we'll thank the church for holding up at that end and preventing sort of a radical legalization and radical widespread use of abortion.
Might we see some sort of a split as a result of this in the Catholic Church in the same way that we've seen a split in the Presbyterian Church or in the Episcopal Church over gay rights or gay priests or gay marriages?
I'm not exactly an expert on the internal politics of the church, but I think not. I think that would have happened over the last 40 years. The majority of the flock, you know, don't hold the official view of the church itself. But nonetheless, I think there's a deep respect for the fact that it is a matter of principle, in the same way that the church opposes the death penalty and is pretty tough on war as well. It fits into this same category. So it's not an act of prejudice, it's an application of the valuing of life. And there's an appreciation even among those who believe that abortion in some circumstances should be legal.
Susan, I'll give you 10 seconds if you can answer that in 10.
He didn't change policy toward abortion or opposition to abortion. He changed the way in which people can seek mercy if they choose to, and it's hard to imagine that that's going to cause a schism.
Thanks for watching Special Report tonight. Make sure you tune in to Hannity tonight at 10 p.m. for an exclusive interview with the Vice President-elect Mike Pence. I'm Doug McKelway. Good night from Washington. Tucker Carlson tonight, coming up next.